morning. This morning we are continuing our series called Way of Wisdom. We've been preaching verse by verse through the book of Proverbs, and we find ourselves now at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And in fact, Proverbs 3, 1 through 12 was the passage that we learned last week as well. We learned it last week, and then we're going back to it a second time this week. And that is because last week we focused on the even-numbered verses in this passage, right? Verse like 2, 4, 6. And today we're going back and focusing on the odd-numbered verses, like 1, 3, 5, 7. And I guess I'll start off, especially if you weren't here last week, letting you know, ordinarily this is a terrible way to study a book of a Bible. Okay, or studying the Bible as a whole, or any book for that matter. Like if you go to the library and you check out a book and decide, oh, I'm going to read every other sentence until I get to the end, and then when I'm done, I'll go back to the beginning and read all the sentences I skipped. Like, would that help you understand the book better? No, it would not. Okay, so I'm saying normally if you show up at a church and the pastor or the teacher says, let's skip every other verse, you should probably run away. Okay, most of the time that's the case. However, as I explained last week, this particular passage is an exception. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12 is a list of 6 instructions and 6 blessings from God that are connected to obeying the 6 instructions. And so it just so happens that the odd-numbered verses 1, 3, 5, 7, are the verses that have the commands, the instructions, the do this part. And then it's the even-numbered verses, 2, 4, 6. Those are the verses that talk about, and this is the way that God will bless you if you obey the commands. And so last week we covered the 6 verses that were the 6 blessings. That is, if we are faithful to God, if we follow Him, if we trust in Him, if we do what He says, what are the blessings that He promises in the book of Proverbs? And then we even talked about it across the whole Bible. What is it that God gives? How is it that God blesses His people as they obey His commands? So then we said, next week we will move into the odd-numbered verses and actually dive into the specifics of the commands that were given. And so that's the plan for this morning. So I'm going to read to you now Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. I'm not going to read every other verse. I'm going to read the whole passage, just like we did last week, even though we're going to focus on the odd numbers. But here's the whole passage. Proverbs 3, starting in verse 1. And you'll be able to see the every other, command, blessing, as you see the verses come up. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands. Right? There's the command. And then the blessing is, verse 2, for they will bring you many days, a full life, and well-being. And then the next command, never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart. And then the result, verse 4, then you will find favor and high regard in the sight of God and man. And it continues, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. Think about Him in all your ways, and He will guide you on the right paths. Don't consider yourself to be wise. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. This will be healing for your body and strengthening for your bones. Here's another command. Honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. And here's the blessing. And your barns will be completely filled, and your vats will overflow with new wine. And then, do not despise the Lord's instruction, my son, and do not loathe His discipline. For the Lord disciplines the one He loves, just as a father, the son He delights in. So my plan for this morning with those 12 verses is to, like I said, focus on the 6 odd-numbered verses and focus on what they would have communicated to the original readers. Okay, that what would these verses have communicated to a young man who's an Israelite, like in ancient times? What would they have got out of these verses? So I'm going to start with that. Okay, what did this communicate to the original readers? And then the second half of the sermon, I'd like to draw out 3 exhortations from this passage for us nowadays. Not just how did they take it and what did it mean for them, but what does it mean for us? How can we apply this to our life in Ocala in the year 2021? So before we get into that, though, let's go ahead and just go verse by verse, or at least odd verse by odd verse. Here we go. Verse 1. The passage begins with, My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands. This verse, which is the verse at the beginning of the chapter, is sort of the introductory verse of the chapter, and it is very similar to other verse, like the last 2 sections of Proverbs that we learned started almost the same way. This is the way that a new section of Proverbs starts. Like back in Proverbs 1:8, it said, listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and don't reject your mother's teaching. And then there was instruction. And then you get to chapter 2, and chapter 2 begins with, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you. And then you have chapter 2, and then we get to chapter 3. My son, don't forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commands. So the introduction to these sections is, they are framed as a father giving instruction to his son. And we will see that here in chapter 3, it's just like it was in chapter 1 and chapter 2, which is the father's wisdom that he is giving to his son is related to trusting and following God. So then we move on to verse 3. It says, "Never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. Tie them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart." And that idea of tying something around your neck or writing it on your heart is to say, like, you got to have it. Don't ever let it go. Don't ever let this go. This is something you've got to grasp onto and hang on to. Don't ever let it leave you. Put it in your heart. Wrap it around your neck. Now, what is it that they need to never let go? It's two character qualities, loyalty and faithfulness. And I looked this up. I don't know Hebrew, but I looked this up. And those two words, which obviously our Bibles are translated into English, so the English words here are loyalty and faithfulness, but they are translated from Hebrew words. And those two words in the original Hebrew, as an ancient Israelite would have read it, those same two words are used a lot of times about God and his character. The word that's translated loyalty and the word that's translated faithfulness, those two words appear together many times in the Old Testament to describe the character of God. In the Exodus story, he is described that way. Multiple times in the Psalms, where they would sing these songs about God, they would sing songs about God with these qualities, even if it's translated into a different word in English, which I will show you. So let me show you Exodus chapter 34. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, it says this. It says, "Then the Lord passed in front of him and proclaimed." The him there is Moses. This is Moses going up on Mount Sinai, I believe for the second time, to get second set of 10 commandments, because the first set of 10 commandments he broke. Okay, so he goes, so this is, Lord passed in front of him, Moses, a second time, and this is how he reveals. This is what he proclaims to Moses. He says, God says, "Yahweh, Yahweh is a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, and rich in," now this is just interesting, "faithful love and truth." And in English, it might not stick out to us. Well, those are just two whole other words. No, in the original, that word faithful love is the same word that's translated loyalty in Proverbs chapter 3. And the word that's translated truth is the same word that's translated faithfulness in Proverbs chapter 3. Apparently, there was a word in Hebrew that meant like steadfast, loyal love. There was another word that meant truth, faithfulness, firmness. And so in this particular passage, God uses the words to say about him, "I am rich in faithful love and truth." But in Proverbs, it specifically says you are to have this steadfast love or this loyalty and this firmness, this certainty, this faithfulness. So the same two words that God reveals himself, that's what we see being said to the people who are being trained by Proverbs. It's not just in Exodus. Like I said, it's also in their songbook. The book of Psalms is the ancient Israelite songbook, and so this is one of the lyrics to one of their songs. This is Psalm 115, verse 1. So this is a Bible verse, but it's also, we've got to remember, these are lyrics to songs that they probably sang over and over and over again. And this is what they sang. "Not to us, Yahweh, not to us, but to your name give glory because of your," there it is, "your faithful love, because of your truth." And that's not the only one like that. So I'm telling you that because now we go to Proverbs chapter 3, and I just want you to notice when they come to this section that says that what you have to have written on your heart is never let loyalty and faithfulness leave you. And if you're someone that's reading this in Hebrew, you're going to go like, oh, these two character qualities are the things that we're always singing about God, what God is. This is the way God revealed himself to Moses. It may very well be that what this would have communicated to the original readers was, be like God. Imitate God. May your character be like his character. And then you go to verse 5. And in fact, I'm going to take verse 5 and verse 7 and put them together because I think that they are very connected. I think they're related. I think that they are almost like the same verse two times, just worded differently. So verse 5 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding." And then verse 7 says, "Don't consider yourself to be wise. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil." And I think this idea of trusting in the Lord with all your heart is very similar to this idea of fearing the Lord, that those are not two way different commands, that those are overlapping commands, that to revere the Lord and respect the Lord and trust the Lord, that's all connected. And to turn away from evil is all connected. To trust the Lord is to turn away from evil. To revere God is to turn away from what he says is wrong. And so those are not, I think, way different commands. In fact, Proverbs 8:13, I'm not going to turn there, but I'm just going to let you know. Proverbs 8 says, "To fear the Lord is to hate evil." Right? To fear the Lord is to hate evil. So when we look at here and we go, okay, so I'm supposed to trust the Lord and fear the Lord and turn away from evil, that's not like 3 wildly different instructions. That's kind of one big super instruction, right? I'm supposed to trust the Lord, fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. That's all one thing, reverencing and worshiping the true God. And then the other half of each of those 2 verses, I think, are also kind of repetitions of each other. That is, do not rely on your own understanding is very similar to don't consider yourself to be wise, right? Don't go, well, I know everything. And so the idea here in these 2 verses is following God will require humility. Following God will require humility. You cannot think you have all the answers. All right, the next verse is verse 9, at least the next odd verse is verse 9. It says this, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. They were to honor the Lord with their possessions, and then a specific example is given, the first produce of their entire harvest. What is that talking about? Like, what would that have meant for an ancient Israelite? And I think what's helpful to know is, prior to Proverbs 3 being written, there had already been other books of the Bible that had been written. Okay? There were books of the Bible that were written earlier than Proverbs. And so at the time that Proverbs was written, Israel is already this established kingdom. And now you have these young people in the kingdom who are learning the book of Proverbs. But that kingdom that they're living in has been shaped culturally by commands that came way before the book of Proverbs, one of which would be the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy was written for the people of God for when they got into the kingdom, when they got into the promised land, what they were to do. So there are things that were commanded years and years and years earlier that shaped the culture of the people that are living during the time of Proverbs. So when they read, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest, that's not the first time they're hearing words like that. That's not the first time what does it mean, the first produce of the harvest? No, they would go, oh yeah, this is something our ancestors have been doing for quite some time. It goes back to Deuteronomy. So let me show it to you. Deuteronomy chapter 26. I'm going to read the first 11 verses because that's the section on the first fruits or the first produce. Okay, here it is. Deuteronomy 26, starting in verse 1. It says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, and you take possession of it and live in it. So let me pause here. So this is written in an earlier time period. Proverbs, they're already living in the land. This is written here. This is before they live in the land. This is God telling them, you're about to get the land. At this point, the land is just promised. All right? It's not even your land yet. I'm promising you this land. You're going to get into the promised land, and I'm going to give it to you. There's a point where you're going to get to a patch of dirt, and it's going to be my patch of dirt that I give to you. And that dirt is going to produce crops. And I'm telling you now, before I have even given you the dirt, I'm telling you now what I want you to do with the crops that are going to come out of that dirt. I'm telling you ahead of time what I want. So this is what he says, verse 2. You must take some of the first of all of the land's produce that you harvest from the land Yahweh your God is giving you, and put it in a container. All right, simple enough so far. So I've got some crops that come up. The very first crops that come up, I'm putting in a container. Check. Now what? Then go to the place where the Lord your God chooses to have his name dwell. Okay? Do I bring along the container? Yes, that's what you put in the container for. So you bring it with you. You go to the place. Now what? Verse 3. When you come before the priest who is serving at that time, you must say to him, today I acknowledge to the Lord your God that I have entered the land the Lord swore to our fathers to give to us. Then the priest will take the container from your hand and place it before the altar of the Lord your God. And you are to respond by saying in the presence of the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt with a few people and lived there. And there he became a great, powerful, and populous nation. But the Egyptians mistreated and afflicted us, and forced us to do hard labor. So we called out to Yahweh, the God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our cry and saw our misery, hardship, and oppression. Then the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, with terrifying power, and with signs and wonders. He led us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. I have now brought the first of the land's produce that you, Lord, have given me. You will then place the container before the Lord your God and bow down to him. You, the Levite and the foreign resident among you, will rejoice in all the good things the Lord your God has given you and your household. So if you're an ancient Israelite and you're being taught through Proverbs 3 and you get to the part where it says you're honoring the Lord with the first of your produce, you realize like, oh yeah, that's what they've been doing all these years. I know about that. That's this practice that we have, that when the first produce comes, we don't even know what's going to come next, but when the first produce comes, we put that in a place where we then can bring it to the priest and give it over to him. We are taking our possessions and giving them away. Like back then, they didn't use money so much as like, hey, I'll trade you a goat for some wine, and how about, I'll give you, you give me a sheep, I'll give you some olive oil. And so we are taking our possessions and we are giving them away for the purpose of what? In this case, it is to honor God. I am showing up with my stuff to say to the Lord, thank you. Thank you for this land that produced the crops. Thank you for what you've given me. Thank you for saving us from Egypt. And so I honor God in this way by giving over these possessions. And this was actually one of many ways that the Old Testament followers of God would give away possessions in order to honor the Lord. Like this is just one. This is the one about the first fruits or the first produce. There were other things that they were told to do as well. There were regulations about, like in their field, that they were not to harvest the corners of the field. The corners of the field were to be left unharvested so that poor people could come and harvest from the corners of the field and they would be able to eat. There were other times that they gave tithes, and there are lots of Christians that talk about tithes and tithing in the Bible. And actually in the Old Testament, there's multiple tithes. That's just a word that means 1/10, okay, or 10% of the whole. And there were multiple tithes in the Old Testament. Sometimes they were to do 10% of all of the harvest at the end of the year. Sometimes it was 10% at the end of 3 years, which would be 3% per year, right? So there were all different tithes that they did. But one of the things that they kind of all had in common is this money was given away in a particular way, and we'll talk about that more later. This was possessions that they were giving away to honor the Lord. All right, then verses 11 and 12, the last two verses of this section. It says, do not despise the Lord's instruction, my son, and do not loathe his discipline, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as a father, the son he delights in. So he says, honor the Lord with your possessions, and I will bless you. And then he says, do not despise the Lord's instruction. Do not loathe his discipline. Because he loves you. He's treating you like a son. He's a father, the son that he delights in. That apparently it was like, follow the Lord and these blessings will come. And it seems as though there will be times that you don't follow the Lord and the Lord will do something. And the thing that he does is not forsake you, but correct you. This passage shows that sometimes God disciplines a person who he loves, and the way that the discipline is supposed to be received is not that God is trying to harm them, but that God is helping them. And in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 12 actually quotes this proverb. Okay, this proverb shows up in the book of Hebrews, like maybe about 1,000 years later. So it's in Proverbs, and then it's in Hebrews. And the writer of Hebrews quotes the verse and then elaborates on it a little bit. And I think it's helpful for us to, when we know that, to check it out. In other words, if you're ever reading through the Old Testament and you think, oh, I wonder what this means. If you ever do come across the section of the Old Testament that appears again in the New Testament, right, is re-quoted in the New Testament, and the New Testament person elaborates on it, well, then it's a good idea to check and see what they said. Like, it's not a bad idea to go, okay, what did these people who wrote the second half of the Bible think the first half of the Bible meant? So we're going to do that. Might as well, right? We got time. So Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 5, is where you have it. Right? The writer of Hebrews is writing, and he says, and you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. And then here's the quote or the paraphrase, whatever you want to call it. This is where he references Proverbs. My son, do not take the Lord's discipline lightly or faint when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and punishes every son he receives. And then the next verse, which is not a quote from Proverbs, is him elaborating on it. He continues talking, and he says, endure suffering as discipline. God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? And then later on in the same paragraph, he says, for they disciplined us for a short time, based on what seemed good to them. The they and the them there is talking about earthly fathers. But he, the he there is talking about God, he does it for our benefit, so that we can share in his holiness. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields the fruit of peace and righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And so there are hard things that happen to us in this life. But if you belong to God, those things are not meant to harm you. They are meant to bring about righteousness. And it won't last forever. Jesus will rescue us from all suffering one day. So, that's Proverbs 3, verses 1 through 12, okay? And specifically, the odd-numbered verses. We covered them. That's what I believe they mean, and specifically what they meant to the original readers, and even people rereading it in the time period of the New Testament. What I'd like to do now is, for the second half of this sermon, I want to end with giving you 3 exhortations that are drawn from this passage, and they're exhortations that are not what does an ancient Israelite do, but what are we supposed to do in light of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. So these are my 3 points, if you want to know who the 3 points of the sermon are. It is trust in God, even in the hard times, honor the Lord with your possessions, and trust in God, not you. Those are the 3 exhortations that I want to leave us with and talk about what they have to do with our life currently. So, we'll go one at a time, starting with trust in God, even in the hard times. I put that as my point because of the 2 verses that we just read, verses 11 and 12 of the chapter. It seems to me that the writer of Proverbs and the writer of Hebrews, when he quotes Proverbs, are both trying to make it clear that God's discipline is not to be despised because it's a sign of his love. And that idea reminds me of a quote from C.S. Lewis that I want to read to you from this book. And in fact, it's not a quote from C.S. Lewis, the person. It's actually a quote from C.S. Lewis, the character, in the play Shadowlands. So I don't know if you know this, but C.S. Lewis was a very influential British Christian author. And in the 90s, they did a Broadway show about his life. Like, living in this year, looking back, that seems crazy to me. I don't know if it does to you, but like the fact that C.S. Lewis's life was a show on Broadway, I'm like, the 90s must have been crazy. I can't believe that was a thing, but it's true. So this very influential Christian author had a Broadway show about his life. It's called Shadowlands. This is the script. It was made into a movie starring Anthony Hopkins even in the 90s. Okay, so these words, I don't know if C.S. Lewis ever said them or not. They very well could be in his writings somewhere, but because that's how they based the character, based on what his writings were. But I'm just going to read you what the C.S. Lewis character says in Shadowlands. This is really early on in the play. This was said from a Broadway stage. It's crazy to me. All right, here it is. It says this: God loves us, so he makes us the gift of suffering. Through suffering, we release our hold on the toys of this world and know that our true good lies in another world. We're like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what make us perfect. The suffering in the world is not the failure of God's love for us. It is that love in action. For believe me, this world that seems to us so substantial is no more than the Shadowlands. Real life has not begun yet. I think that's very powerful. That's why the play was named Shadowlands. And I think that there are 2 things in there that are biblical and helpful. One is that God uses suffering for our good, and the other is that it won't last forever. That these are the Shadowlands. And that is not everything that the Bible says about suffering, but those are 2 helpful things for us to know in the midst of hard times. Number 2, honor the Lord with your possessions. This is not a particularly creative way to phrase it. It's actually just the first half of verse 9. Verse 9 says, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. And I wanted to talk about how we can obey that in the year 2021. And I think the first thing we should do, if we really want to obey that verse in this year in Ocala, the first thing we need to do is note that we cannot obey this verse literally the way they did back then. Do you agree? Yeah, you cannot. There's no way. I think there's nobody in here that's a farmer. But just in case there is one of you, I will say 99% of you in this room cannot bring the first produce of your entire harvest, right? This is being given to an agricultural society. So that's one thing that's a difference right there. Those of us that are in this room cannot bring the produce from our harvest. And even if there happen to be someone who slipped in here that you're like, yep, that's what I do. I'm a farmer. And in fact, I don't use money. I just trade goats for olive oil and grapes for barley, okay? And somehow I get around in Ocala that way. Well, good for you. I am impressed. But even so, you can't go to the temple in Jerusalem and hand it over to a Levite, can you? So the first thing I think we need to acknowledge is if we want to obey this passage, you cannot obey it literally the way they could. Can we just admit that we're not in this system? Right, all right, good. So we admit that. Now, if we're going to obey it, then I want to ask the question, then how can we obey this passage in principle? Since we can't obey it literally because there's not a Levite in a temple and a harvest, how can we obey this passage in principle? So the first thing I would suggest is we change the word produce to the word dollars. Because that's the way that we handle things. They exchange things. Hey, I'll give you some barley, you give me some wine, but we're in a different situation. And so we are trading as we are trying to handle our life in dollars. So the principle of the verse, if we're going to obey it, this verse is about not so much really about agriculture. It is about how am I going to channel my dollars to honor the Lord with my possessions. Okay, so they've taken their crops, which we're now thinking of in terms of dollars, and they're using them to support things, right? They're bringing them to a priest in a temple. Now, what is it being used for? Why are they bringing a container with stuff? And like I said, and there's not just one container with stuff because it wasn't just first fruits. There were other things that they were supposed to do. There were tithes that they were supposed to bring in. So what do we do with this? When we have these ancient Israelites honoring the Lord with their possessions in a way that we can't, but we think, well, in principle, what is it that they were funding? As they were taking their possessions and honoring the Lord and giving the possessions away, what were they supporting? And so I wanted to give you sort of just a brief summary of what Old Testament giving and what New Testament giving supported. Like where did the crops go? Where did the money go? And so if I can summarize a whole bunch of passages and kind of just give you an overview, I would say this. In the Old Testament, the wealth that was given to support the temple, to support the temple practices, to support the religious festivals that the Old Testament believers had. It was to support the religious workers, like the priests. It was essentially, some of it was used for their salary. That is, the priests were taken from the Levite clan or the Levite tribe, and they did not have a land inheritance like the other Israelite tribes did. So if you don't know this, just quick little education on this. They show up at the promised land, and most of the tribes, all but one tribe, all gets land. This is the land for the Benjaminites, and this is the land for the people of Judah, and here's the land for these people. And then the Levites, no land. You get no land. You all get dirt, no dirt for you. All right, now the people who all get the land, they're growing the crops. The other group that didn't get any land was supposed to do the religious activities related to the temple. Well, what was their inheritance? Everybody else's inheritance was land. Their inheritance was when that land produced crops, a certain percentage of it was given over to the Levites as the way they were to survive and the way they were to live as they did their job, which was the non-agricultural job. So when we look at the Old Testament practices, we see they funded the temple and the religious festivals and the religious workers and their salaries and the Levites who had no land so that they were able to survive. And as you look at multiple passages, you'll see that money was also given and stored up and given so that the fatherless and the widow and the immigrant would be able to eat in the land. So you've got Levites who don't own any land, and many of them are doing the priestly work. And then you've got also a widow, and she lost her husband, and she doesn't have anything. And you've got an orphan, and he doesn't have any parents. And you have an immigrant, a foreigner who showed up, and he's living among the people of Israel, right? But he doesn't have any land, and he hasn't really set up shop yet. And the idea is some of these crops that are given, some of this wealth that has been donated is going to be given to Levites and the fatherless and the widows and the immigrants so that they can eat. So it was a way that they would care for the poor. So it was for their religious practices and their religious workers and the poor. Then you move to the New Testament and you go, what did the New Testament giving support? And you'll notice it's very similar. In the New Testament, the money that they gave was to support, first of all, the poor. There were people who had more than they needed and people who had less than they needed, and the people who had more than they needed gave to the people who had less. And there were times where you would have a church that was in a particular area and there was a famine that hit the land, and everybody was doing financially bad all at the same time. And churches that were in other lands that did not have a famine, you know what they did? They raised money and gave it to the people who were in the midst of the famine so that they could survive. They had a distribution system for widows that's talked about in the book of Acts and in the book of 1 Timothy, that the church would take care of these widows who had no other way of survival. And then we looked a couple of weeks ago at the verse in James that talks about caring for orphans. And so we see in the New Testament, even though they had moved a little bit away from this, I'll give you a goat for a jar of olive oil, because by the time you get to the New Testament, there actually are like Roman coins and stuff. But the way that they channeled their money was to care for the poor, and we also see a relationship between them and the mission of the church. God gave his church a mission that they are to go to make disciples all over the world. And that mission has to be funded, right? There are times when maybe someone is sharing the gospel with someone else over a meal. The meal is paid for by somebody. Or somebody goes, I'm going to go tell those people about Jesus, and I've got to get in a boat, and I've got to sail over to get to them, and the ticket on that boat's going to cost money. So the mission of the church had to be funded. And we see in the New Testament that there were apostles and missionaries and preachers and teachers who were funded by other Christians in order to complete the mission of the church. So if I were to take all of that information and then try to simplify, well, how do I honor the Lord with my possessions and the first produce of my entire harvest in principle in the year 2021? And I would say this is what you should do. Financially support churches, organizations committed to God's mission, and the poor. Take your money and support churches, organizations committed to God's mission, and the poor. And also notice that the verse says, honor the Lord with your possessions. That's sort of the general command. And then you have the specific, with the first produce of your entire harvest. Isn't that interesting? That the crops grew up, and there's the first stuff, and those of you that are gardeners, you know, right? There's like the first tomatoes that show up, and then there's like the tomatoes that show up a little later on. And so they were supposed to take the first ones and give them over to God, not knowing how many more were going to come. Just trust God. Here's the first stuff. I don't know if it's going to be a lot or a little after the first stuff, right? And I would think to myself, one application of this for our day and age could be, don't give God your leftovers. Like, don't do this, well, after I've paid for everything, and I've paid every bill, and I've met every single one of my needs, and all of my wants, and I sent in the payment to Netflix and Disney Plus, and all of that is done, then I will look at what's left over, and maybe I'll give some of this to the poor, and some of this to the church. No, what if you budget some of your money that you will give away to the poor, and some of your money that you will give away to God's mission, and you just do that first, and then live on whatever's left. Like, make your lifestyle fit whatever's left. I believe that is a great way to handle this issue. All right, number 3, trust in God, not you. Now, this one is based on verse 5, which is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, or rely not on your own understanding. And the reason I wanted to end on this verse, and the reason I wanted to end on this concept, is because it's personally very dear to me, more so even than in the other passages, just when it comes to my own personal life. I have had to quote that verse to myself many times, much more so than the other verses that are in this chapter. Not very often, if ever, have I needed to say to myself, Mario, honor the Lord with your possessions. Not very often have I had to say to myself, Mario, trust in God even in the hard times. But many times I have had to say to myself, Mario, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. Because there have been times where I have struggled with doubt. There have been times when I've struggled with doubt with God. I will tell you just two times that are very memorable to me and kind of stick out in comparison to the rest of my life. Once in my mid-20s and once in my early 30s, I had these things that I would call doubt attacks. And I'm calling them doubt attacks the same way that people use the phrase like panic attack. You know how when someone has a panic attack, they don't do it on purpose, right? It just sort of overwhelms them in the moment. It may be that there were behaviors or thought patterns or things that they were doing up until the point of the panic attack that contributed to it. But in the moment of the panic attack, they weren't trying to. They didn't sit there and think, I would like to panic and shake for 45 minutes, right? It sort of overwhelmed them, and it happened, and they didn't want it to happen. And that was similar to me, that I felt like I had these doubt attacks, and it may very well be that there were thinking patterns and things that I had done wrong that had led up to it, but I'm saying in the moment that it was happening, I didn't want it to be happening. I wasn't thinking I would like to doubt God this week. I didn't want that, but my mind was being flooded with these thoughts. And I'm asking myself these questions, and maybe you've done the same thing before, where you're sitting there going, is this true? Is he real? Is he really there? Sometimes you pray and you ask God to do things, and sometimes the thing you ask God to do happens. And then sometimes you pray and the thing you ask God to do doesn't happen. And you go, well, maybe he said yes this time, and maybe he said no. But then I have a little thought in my head, maybe you have also, that you go, or maybe that's just what would have happened anyway. And there's no God listening to the prayers. And then you think that. Imagine you're a pastor and that pops into your head and you're like, whoa, what? What do I do with that thought now that I'm thinking it? And I don't want to deny reality, and I'm thinking it through, but this is not really good for my spiritual life, and I'm having these thoughts. Then you come across somebody that you know that you respect a whole lot, and they seem to be such this great Christian, and they let you down. And then their life sort of, their shaken faith sort of shakes your faith. Or maybe you come across things, I've done this before, where you find something in the Bible, and you find another place in the Bible, and you go, this passage seems to be contradicting this passage. They can't both be true. And then you go, well, maybe the reason they don't fit up is because it's a mistake. It's an error in here. It's not like every single word of it's true. And so I would have these doubt attacks, and I didn't know what to do. And so I'll tell you, one of the things I did, especially, one of them was long. One of them was like a year. It had happened every single week. And I think it was almost a solid year that I would have to be dealing with this. And so I called up a friend of mine. He doesn't live here, so that's why I did it by phone. And I basically asked him to be my accountability partner. I didn't use that word at the time because I didn't talk like that. I hardly talk like that, although I'm saying it now because here at this church, we've been talking about that quite a bit, right? A month ago, Bartow McDonald, one of our elders, got up here and he talked about how he's in an accountability group and they hold each other accountable on different issues, specifically pornography was one of them. And so this is similar to that. This guy became my accountability partner, but it wasn't for pornography, it was for doubt. And so he lives in another state, and I picked him because he is super smart, brilliant guy. He has a PhD. He's a college professor. He's written academic papers. He's written a book that was published by Yale University Press, like this very academically scholarly book. He's a brilliant guy, and he loves Jesus, and he loves me. So I called him up, and we talked that year every single Thursday. And as we would talk on the phone, I would share with him, these are the doubts that I had this week. These are the stuff that I thought this week. And we would talk, sometimes we would talk through it, and he would help me think through it. Sometimes he would just pray for me. And I would pray for him, and I would pray for myself, and then I'd go another week. And I'd have more doubts that happened in my head. And then I would talk to him on Thursday, and I would share with him, and we would talk through them, and I would pray for him, and he would pray for me, and I would pray for me, and then another week would go by, and we did it over and over again every single Thursday until they went away, which they did. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to share with you something that I think that I learned that year, or through that process, and I wanted to share it with you. So this is like the timeline of my life, like chronologically, okay? So imagine my life on a timeline. So over here is where I'm a baby, okay? Over here is where I'm dead, okay? And here's my life, moving that direction. So I'm living my life, and then at some point comes a doubt. And then there's some period of time, and then there comes the resolution of that doubt. It could be hours or minutes later. It could be weeks or months later, okay? But you have the doubt, and then at some point it's resolved in your mind. There's the resolution to the doubt. Examples of this might be, like I said, there's someone in your life that you respect. There was a guy in my early 20s that I really respected. Seemed like this wonderful Christian guy. Went to the same church that I did. He was this marriage counselor. He was so incredible, and I wanted to be like him. And then one day his life was exposed as his secret life, total sham. All of the things he was telling married people they ought to do, like he was not doing them. Like just sexual, crazy, just the biggest hypocrite, biggest like sort of sham spiritual life I've ever seen or heard of. And sometimes when something like that happens and it's someone that you respect a lot and you're like, they are so holy, right? They got like double helping of Holy Spirit, I'm pretty sure. And then it turns out they're a big giant hypocrite. Like that shakes your faith sometimes, doesn't it? Has any of that happened to you before? Maybe some of you it's happened for you just recently with Raghavi Zacharias. And then what happens is, as the time goes along, sometimes it's a few weeks or months later, you come to the realization, Jesus either died on the cross for my sins and rose again, or he didn't. And that really has nothing to do with whether this particular person was obeying Jesus or not. Right? There are going to be people who disobey God. There are going to be people who profess faith in Jesus and fall away. And that's sort of a whole separate issue from, did Jesus actually die on the cross for my sins and rise again? And will I live with him forever? And at some point you realize, yeah, it's terrible that they did that, but it's not really what my faith is based on. And it's resolved. Not the moment you heard about it, but later on as you thought about it more. Do you know what I'm talking about? Here's another one that happened with me. I was reading the book of Ephesians, like Christians are supposed to do. And I came across this place in Ephesians where the author of the book of Ephesians, Paul, quotes from a psalm in the Old Testament. And I don't know if a lot of you do, you might just read through it and you don't care, but sometimes I look when they quote the Old Testament, there's that little letter or something, and it shows you like, oh, this is a quote from Psalms. And so I decided, let me look back and see what psalm he's quoting. So I just read what he said Psalm says, and then I flip back and actually read it, and it did not match. In fact, it didn't. He misquoted the psalm, and not just a little bit, like way off. Like one word was like seemed to mean like the opposite. I mean, he made it seem to kind of teach a different thing. Like he didn't quote it right. And I realize there's some of you that might hear that and you might go, oh, well, what's the big deal? But for some of us, it's like, well, is this book trustworthy or not? So at the time, I think I was 26 when I discovered that. And I'm sitting there going, how in the world can I trust this book as the inerrant word of God if the dudes who wrote the second half of it can't even properly quote the dudes that wrote the first half of it? And it bothered me, right? So here I am. I don't know the answer to that, but it bothers me. Sometimes I'll share it, something like this with my wife, and I'll go, look at this. Does this bother you? And she'll go, nope. And so there I am, all alone, hanging out in here. And what am I supposed to do? And my spiritual life is sort of hanging on this, right? Do I trust God or not? And it seems like he makes mistakes, and his people make mistakes, and there's all this. What do we do? And then there came a point where it was resolved for me. Like there came a point where I realized we all do this, and no one thinks it's dishonest or misquoting. There are times when many of us quote a particular document or a particular source, especially a well-known one. But when we quote it, we actually sort of paraphrase. We change some of the wording because we're quoting it and we're trying to quote sort of like the principle of the passage or the principle of whatever document it is we're quoting, but we're applying it to a different situation than what it was originally talking about. And so sometimes when we do that, we quote a passage and change some of the wording to make it fit the issue that we are talking about contemporarily. You with me on this? You know how you've done this before sometimes? And we don't consider that to be dishonest. We don't consider that to be falsehood. We don't consider that to be a mistake when someone repurposes words and says it's like this, but it's over here, and they change the word some as they repurpose the quote for the new teaching. Well, now I know that, right? The resolution came, but there was a point where I didn't. And so I guess what I wanted to leave you with was this idea. To me, it seems like when you look at trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding, I think it's kind of easy to trust in the Lord during these times. Before the doubt comes. That's kind of easy. And it's easy to trust in the Lord during these times, right? Because now I got the answer to my question and it's resolved. The issue is, what am I supposed to do in these times? And I realize, and this is the thing I think maybe I learned through struggling through all this, that there's one of two things you can do during those times. You can default to trusting in the Lord with all your heart, or you can default to relying on your own understanding. You can actually kind of get yourself into a habit. And you can get yourself into the habit of trust, or you can get yourself into the habit of, when this happens, I default to relying on my own understanding. As you live your life, and you're going to do one of these two things, and it makes all the difference in the world for your spiritual life. If you're living your life going, trusting, boom, it happens. If you default to trust, if you default to, God, I don't know the answer to this, but I do know enough about you to trust you anyway during this time. Then you will live as the Lord wants you to live, and you will follow him, acknowledging that you don't know everything, but you know enough to trust him. But if you, during these times, decide, no, God, what I'm going to do is rely on me and my understanding of the situation. I am going to consider myself wise enough to solve this, and if I can't solve it, then I'm just going to assume, if I disagree with you, I'm just going to go with me over you until you have resolved it. And I'm not trying to be like bossy God. Here's the thing. I'm not saying I'll never trust you. I'm saying I will be happy to start trusting you again once you answer my questions, right? So I'm living my life. I've come across something related to you that I do not understand and I don't have the answer to. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to default to, God, I'm going to doubt you until you answer the question. And I am gracious enough that if you do resolve my doubts, I will happily follow you and trust in you. Okay? But until you do, I'm out here on my own trusting in me. I'm out here doubting you. It seems to me you're going to do one or the other. You're going to get yourself into a habit that you're either going to default to trust or you're going to default to rely on you. And I'm telling you, if you pick this one, if you pick rely on you, if you pick on I will doubt until I get my questions answered, I just want you to know, then you will always be doubting God. Because you're never going to have all the answers to your questions. Not if you're a good question asker, right? If you're a good question asker, you're not going to have an answer to every single one of your questions. You're a human being. You will never know everything. And if you've decided I'm going to doubt God in the cases where I can't understand it all, you will always be doubting God. Because as a human, you will never get all your questions answered. And so what I'm saying is what I think I've learned about trusting God in these times is choosing to trust God in this time is not me denying reality for the sake of my faith. It's me acknowledging the reality that I don't know everything. It's me obeying this verse. Don't consider yourself to be wise. Do not rely on your own understanding. And I feel like that lesson was taught to me like at a cost. When I say at a cost, I mean like there was psychological pain involved. Like it was a year of struggling through it. And what I was hoping to do in this sermon was to pass it on to some of you for free. Maybe you could learn from my struggles, and you could trust in the Lord and not rely on your own understanding. Let's pray. God, I thank you for these people and the opportunity to share this with them. I thank you for what you've done in my life. I thank you for how you ministered to me and you saved me from doubt. I look back in those years and I thank you for what you've done in my life and what you've taught me. I thank you for it. I pray that I would be able to use that to help other people even now. I remember at the time, I don't know if it was Heidi or my accountability partner, but I feel like somebody said something like, maybe God's putting you through this so you'll be able to help others later. And I remember at the time thinking like, that's not worth it. I don't want to help others later. I don't want to be going through it at all. And I mean, that seems, selfish and dumb now, looking back. So I want to thank you. I want to thank you for what you've done in my life, and I specifically thank you for saving me from that kind of self-reliance. And I pray that I just feel like there's got to be some people in this room similar enough to me that they're kind of in the same boat, or they were in the same boat, or they're about to step onto the same boat. And I just pray you'd help them. And I pray you'd save them from the very same thing that you saved me from. I pray you'd use them to help others down the road. I just pray that you'd save us from our doubts. I pray for anybody in this room who's struggling to honor you with their possessions, and that they would give you the first fruits of what you've blessed them with, and they would give to you, that they would support your causes in order to honor you, and out of thanksgiving that you have saved them. And I pray that you'd help us to trust you in hard times. And we thank you for the blessings. We thank you that you will guide our paths. We thank you that you will bless us. We thank you that you will use things in our life to correct us. And so I pray for the people of Good News Church. Make us into people who trust you. Thank you for the gospel. I think I prayed this in the first service, but I think it's worth praying again. I thank you for saving me 2,000 years ago by dying on the cross for my sins, but I thank you for saving me more recently by you, Holy Spirit, coming into my life and changing me and changing my heart. Like that you would change me from a doubter to a truster. Like in some ways it seems safe to me to say you didn't do that 2,000 years ago, you did that in my life. And so I want to thank you for the people in this room that you saved 2,000 years ago, and I want to thank you for the people in this room that you're saving them now. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Let's end with these good words from God's word. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. Think about him in all your ways, and he will guide you on the right paths. That is good news.